Good day to you. My name is Angela Stent. I'm the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. And today we have the World Affairs Council of Charlotte Foreign Policy Series program with Dr. Angela Stent, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And she's the author of the book called Putin's World and Putin's War, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. So the book is Putin's War, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. And the conversation we will have today is on Putin's world. Dr. Stent is also the director, and we can go back for a second, of Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. And one of our colleagues from the World Affairs Council of Charlotte went to Georgetown University and studied there and probably had a class with you. It's a great institution of higher education, especially on foreign affairs and policy. So I want to thank you all for being here, the board members of the World Affairs Council, our members and supporters. And I would also like to use this opportunity to thank the corporate partners of the World Affairs Council. With the individual members and corporate partners is what allows us to have programs like this and share that with you. So thank you, Bank of America, No One Health. Thank you, Atrium Health, Charlotte University. Thank you, DHG, Rogers, and Truist, and PDM, and many other partners, corporate partners of the World Affairs Council. As you all know about the World Affairs Council Charlotte, global education is our passion. We are the community's premier global education nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we believe that everyone deserves access to fact-based and balanced analysis, commentary, and research on critical global issues. Dialogue, knowledge, active participation and understanding of global issues are vitally important for our democracy to flourish at all levels. Couple of housekeeping items, very important. Your microphone will be on mute and your camera will be turned off during the duration of this presentation. We do have a question and answer part of this program, and we would like you to submit questions. To submit a question, please use the question and answer box in the Zoom toolbar. You can see it circled in red right in the middle. Please do not use the chat box. We need your questions in the question and answer box here in the Zoom toolbar. Please note that this presentation will be recorded and it will be shared via our World Affairs Council mailing list with you. So please make sure you're signed up to receive our emails so you can get the recording of this very important and interesting presentation. We have a couple of upcoming programs we'll quickly share with you. We have Roman Popadiuk, who is the first US ambassador to Ukraine and senior career foreign service officer, currently retired, and the former chairman of the board of the World Affairs Councils of America, our umbrella organization. And he's going to speak on the consequences of Russia's war on Ukraine. We have a program, private dinner on May 11th and a luncheon on May the 12th of 2022. There are seats available. Please do register for this program. It's coming next week, and you can find it on our website, the World Affairs Council website. We do have the Ambassador Circle Series panel program coming up on May 26th with the Ambassador of Germany to the US, Emily Haber, Stavros Lambrinidis, Ambassador of the European Union to the US, and Martin Weiss, the Ambassador of Austria to the US. They will speak on America and the geopolitical Europe, transatlantic relations in an era of global conflicts. This is going to be on May 26, 2022, a luncheon. We have for you that are of a certain age, means between 20 and 40 and above, the Young Professionals World Affairs Council Charlotte event. It's called Drink About It series, and it is with panelists from Arrival, Duke Energy, and Sustain Charlotte, and they will speak on the climate change. They will have a conversation on climate change. It's an evening program, a lot of fun. Please join us. Finally, we have Mark Polymeropoulos, who is the former CIA head of clandestine operations in Europe and Eurasia. He's going to speak on clarity in crisis, leadership lessons from the CIA. This is going to be on May 18th and 19th, 2022, a private dinner on May 18th and a lunch on May 19th. So all of these programs that I mentioned our live programs. And to finalize on June 7, 2022, the big gala, the big spring opening event, the World Citizen Award that we provide, and we are giving it this year and honoring Brian Moynihan, who is the chairman and CEO of Bank of America. We have just announced the individual tickets sale for this event opened yesterday. So if you're interested in join us on June 7th, it's an evening black tie gala event. Please go to our website and we will be happy to have you join us. We are on all social media, you know that, but I just want to repeat it. Please do like, share, and follow www.worldaffairscharlotte.org. That is our website. This is where you can see our programs, upcoming programs, and get your tickets for them. And now it is my pleasure to share with you the biography of Dr. Angela Stent, who is the senior advisor to the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies and Professor Emerita of Government and Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She's also a senior non-resident fellow at the Brook Institution and co-chairs its Hewitt Forum on Post-Soviet Affairs. From 2004 to 2006, she served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. From 1992 to 2001, Angela has served in the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State. Her recent publications include The Limit of Partnership, U.S.-Russian Relations in the 21st Century, for which she won the American Academy of Diplomacy's Douglas Dillon Prize for the best book on the practice of American diplomacy. And her latest book, which we're discussing today, is Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest, for which she won the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy's Prize for the best book on U.S.-Russian relations. That is so impressive, Dr. Stent. She was a member of the Senior Advisory Panel for NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe for Admiral James Stavridis and General Philip Breedlove. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and also contributing editor to Survival, and is on the editorial boards of the Journal of Cold War Studies, World Policy Journal, International Politik in Mirovia Ekonomika I Međunarodne Otočtenje journal. She has served on the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council for Russia and Central Asia, and Dr. Stent is also a trustee of the Eurasia Foundation. Angela received her BA from Cambridge University, her Master of Science with distinction from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and her MA and PhD from Harvard University. A really amazing bio. We have a lot of experts come and talk to the World Affairs Council, Dr. Stent, but this is just an incredible background. Let me just share with everyone who probably knows this, but doesn't know that Vladimir means reign peace in translation, or let there be peace, which is, I think, ironic in light of what is happening these days. So to learn more about Vladimir Putin and all about what is happening in the world right now, I turn it over to Dr. Angela Stent. Thank you so very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm delighted to speak to your group. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. So I thought what I would do is ask a couple of questions, which I ask in my book, Putin's World, and then we will go on to discuss the current situation in the war between Russia and Ukraine. And, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned the word Vladimir, because, of course, that's also the first name of the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr, the Ukrainian version of the same name. So ironic indeed. So the first question I wanted to ask, and I think a lot of people have been asking, particularly since the invasion began on February 24th, is why was the West so wrong when the Soviet Union collapsed? We thought that post-Soviet Russia would want to integrate with the global economy, would want to integrate with the West in some form, and that it would want to develop into a more pluralistic, a more modern society. And then we were also wrong, I think, in believing that if we offered trade relationships, if we got more economically tied to Russia, we, that is the Europeans and the Americans, that this would somehow have a moderating influence on its political behavior. In other words, we did believe that through trade and economic intercourse, the political situation could improve too. And then the second major question I think we do have to ask is, how was Putin's Russia, with a GDP the size of that of Italy, with a declining population and particularly male mortality rates for young men aged 18 to 30 are similar to those in sub-Saharan Africa. So with a real demographic problem, with crumbling infrastructure and with excessive dependence on exports of hydrocarbons, how was that Russia able to reassert itself on the world stage, going back to places from which the Soviet Union had retreated? And why? And we see that very much on display today, and I will talk about that at the end of my talk. Why is it that while the West has a very difficult relationship with Russia and has had for some time, that much of the rest of the world regards Russia as a large authoritarian country with whom it can do business? And so these are all things that I think have contributed to where we are today in this very difficult moment. So let me go back to the question of why we were wrong. And to put it kind of briefly, I would say, I think a lot of people in the West believe that the problems of dealing with the Soviet Union is because we were dealing with communists or people who aspired to be communists, when the real reason for the difficulty of dealing with them was because they were Russians. And by that, I don't mean any kind of character assassination. What I mean is that Russians have their own unique view of the world, of their place in the world, and a very different understanding of the drivers of world politics, and in fact, of the drivers of the relationship between the government and the governed. If you go back in Russian history, history is very much on everyone's minds because Vladimir Putin talks about history a lot of the time, versions of history which maybe we wouldn't agree with, but he's very much a history man. But if we look at some of the ideas that inform Russia's view of its own place in the world, and the first idea or the first phenomenon that you encounter is the concept of the Russian idea. If you go back to the famous 19th century poet Fyodor Tuchev, he wrote that, and I quote, "There can be no alliance between Russia and the West, either for the sake of interests or for the sake of principles." And he recommended that the solution for Russia was to try and sow divisions within the West. So this suspicion toward the West, this fear of the West, this belief that Russia and the West were inexorably doomed, if you like, to be antagonists, this is something that goes back quite far in Russian history. And we see that very much with us today. Putin has on numerous occasions said that the West is trying to break up Russia, to weaken Russia. Remember, he has justified this war by saying that the US was going to use Ukraine to attack Russia. So this idea of kind of Russia being vulnerable to outside aggression, and particularly, in the last century, to aggression by the West is very much there. And the other aspect of this Russian idea, so we're not the West, we're different. But the other aspect of the Russian idea is the concept of Russia as a communal civilization, as a communal Eurasian civilization, apart from the West, superior to the West, and one which can really never be reconciled with the West. And Putin has often criticized what he says is the materialistic, individualistic West, and praised the kind of more collectivist, communal Russia. And he, in the last major speech he gave at the Valdai International Forum, which was last September, for instance, he spent a large part of his speech, after criticizing the United States, in criticizing particularly woke culture in the United States and what he calls satanic Christianity, saying that the West has lost its way, that Western Christianity, because it supports things like LGBTQ rights and other progressive social causes, let's say, has lost its way, and that Russia is the harbinger of the true Christianity. And you can see this again and again. The patriarch in Moscow today, Patriarch Kirill, who's very much behind this war against Ukraine, has said very similar things in all of his sermons, including last Sunday, believe it or not, claiming that Russia had never invaded another country. This is all part of this idea of this kind of unique and superior Russian civilization and Russian idea against that of the decadent West. Now, another very important aspect of Russia's historical view of its place in the world is that historically, Russia has always tried to expand to control its neighbors to the east, its neighbors to the west, and its neighbors to the south. Russia became an empire by annexing, by invading and then conquering neighboring territories. And the famous Empress Catherine the Great in the 18th century, herself, of course, originally a German princess, but then very much imbibed this Russian idea. She famously said, "That which stops growing begins to rot. I have to expand my borders in order to make my country more secure." So this idea of defensive expansionism, which of course we see today being played out as we speak in Ukraine, goes back to the Russia's self-conception of itself as being vulnerable because it had no natural borders except in the north. And because it was vulnerable to invasion, it had to preempt that by seizing territories in neighboring countries. Now, Russia's neighbors, of course, have a very different view of Russia. They see themselves as the victims of Russian aggression. We can talk about Poland, a number of other countries, obviously, that were then part of the Soviet bloc. But this is very much the idea of defensive expansionism is very much present in contemporary Russia. And Russia defines its security perimeter not as the borders of the Russian Federation, but of the borders of the post-Soviet space. And again, we see that playing out very much. Now, on the second question about how Russia was able to play a weak hand so well, how Putin was able to restore Russia to its status as a great power, although he may be now jeopardizing that by this war, there are two real reasons. And the first one is that Putin had a plan. When he became president in 2000, don't forget he's been president now for 22 years, through 5 American presidents so far. When he became president, he said that his goal was to restore Russia to its rightful place as a great power, and also to build a strong state. So he's had a mission. He's been on a mission since he became president. And part of that mission has really been to relitigate the results of the post-Cold War settlement, to question everything that's happened since 1992. Don't forget, in 2005, he famously said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, a judgment with which some of us, I think, might disagree. And he went on to say, it was a catastrophe because 25 million Russians found themselves outside of the Russian Federation, 12 million of those Russians in Ukraine. So it has been his goal to try and regather the lands, to question the legitimacy of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and to bring all Russians back into the fold. And that's, again, what we see playing out here. But the second reason, apart from Putin's own program, why Russia has been able to restore itself to this role has been because Putin has been very adept at taking advantage of opportunities presented to him by a distracted West. We, the United States and our allies in Europe, we really didn't have a plan as Putin had after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And therefore, Putin has been adept at doing that. One of the things that I go to discuss in my book is the fact that Putin became a judo champion in his early 20s. He was the judo champion of Leningrad, as it was then called. And I have a photo in my book of the Leningrad Evening News from 1976, when he was 24, I guess, saying, "This is our new judo champion, and watch, this young man will go far." Well, they didn't realize then exactly how far he would go. But of course, in judo, you can be physically weaker than your opponent. But if you understand his own weaknesses and you understand how to distract him, you can still prevail. And I think those skills, plus the fact that, of course, Putin was trained as a KGB case officer, and therefore also to try and figure out people's weaknesses and how to manipulate them, I think those have helped him also in achieving what he had achieved, at least prior to February the 24th. So now I want to turn to the war in Ukraine and talk about really 4 misconceptions that Putin had when he launched this war and how they have played out as we are now in the 3rd month of this very brutal war. So the first major miscalculation he made was that Ukraine would somehow surrender to Russia quickly, that there would be a blitzkrieg, and in 72 hours, Russia would take Kiev and install a puppet government there. And I have to emphasize, I do not believe that Putin was being well informed by his advisors about the real situation in Ukraine. His understanding of Ukraine is obviously not good, even though he published this famous essay in July, 5,000 words, about how Ukrainians and Russians are brothers and they're the same and there's no such thing as a separate Ukrainian national identity. He just didn't understand how far Ukraine had come. And so he has been really surprised by the extent to which the Ukrainians have fought back. They have a cause that they're fighting for. They believe in it passionately, and that's, you know, to keep their state together and to maintain you know, Ukraine as a sovereign country with the right to choose what it does. And of course, the Ukrainians have been helped by Western weapons, certainly, but everyone has been surprised, by the way, including the United States as well, about how well the Ukrainians have done in fighting against the Russians. They did manage to eject the Russians from Kiev. The Russians lost the first part of this war by not being able to take Kiev. We know what the terrible, terrible human cost for that was, the atrocities that were committed at Bucha and other places outside Kiev, but they have prevailed, the Ukrainians. And what's interesting is that the US, I think, has now decided, particularly since Secretary Blinken and Austin visited Kiev last weekend, they've decided that it's possible that Ukraine could actually win. We can talk about what winning means later, but we'll be able to prevail. So was Putin's first miscalculation. The second miscalculation he made was that about the performance of his own armed forces. And by the way, that's also something where I think the US side thought that the Russian military would perform better than it did. It hasn't performed very well. Its equipment hasn't worked very well. The chain of command hasn't worked well. The young conscripts that were sent there, weren't told where they were going. They thought they were going on military exercises in Belarus, and then suddenly they're in Ukraine and they're told to kill Ukrainians. And morale has been low. There've been desertions. And I think the pervasive corruption that exists throughout Russian society also, of course, pervades the military. And so large sums of money that were supposed to have been spent on equipment, on training people, on modernizing the army, went into people's pockets. And that's why you have this very poor showing of a lot of Russia's equipment, including the fact that instead of having sophisticated communications equipment, they are still communicating commanders and recruits on WhatsApp. So insecure communication. So the performance of the Russian armed forces has been much worse than I think Putin and those around him expected that it would be. Now, the third miscalculation was that Putin looked around. He saw the United States reeling after Afghanistan. He saw the Biden administration trying to get its legislation passed. It couldn't. He saw how polarized America was. He looked at Europe and saw the Germans trying to form a new government, the French preoccupied with their presidential election, the British preoccupied by Brexit. And he thought that the West was weak, it was distracted. And he thought that the Europeans and the Americans had so many problems during the Trump era, and there was such division between them that they wouldn't unite. So he completely underestimated the will of the West to unite in face of this unprovoked attack of a country in the middle of Europe. And then the fourth miscalculation was that Putin believed that the Europeans were so invested in their economic relationship with Russia, and particularly their energy imports from Russia, that they would never go along with really far-reaching sanctions. He expected some sanctions after this invasion, but he didn't expect what he has gotten, which are these full-throated financial sanctions. The EU now saying that it's going to completely wean itself off imports of Russian oil by the end of the year, and export controls, things that we haven't seen since the Cold War. He completely miscalculated that. But the one thing that he did not miscalculate is that in building up his ties with the rest of the world, as I said, the West has one view of Russia, but the rest has a different one. That was an investment that's paid off, because if you look at the United Nations resolutions that were passed after the invasion of Ukraine, there have been 3 resolutions, twice to condemn the invasion and once to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. If you look at the votes there, the people the countries that have abstained or voted with Russia represent more than half the world's population. China, which is Russia's major partner now, China has not condemned Russia, and it has not imposed sanctions on Russia, and it has largely repeated the Russian narrative, saying that this is a result of aggressive NATO policies, and Russia has legitimate security interests which were threatened by the West, and so it has not condemned Russia. I think China doesn't like the specter of this full-throated war taking place in Europe, and the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia also affect China. It has to make decisions about the extent to which it complies with them, and so far it has. But so far it's there to back Russia up, and will continue to do so. India, which is, after all, the world's largest democracy and a partner of the United States in the Quad, so-called Quad of the US, Australia, India, and Japan, it has also not condemned Russia, and it certainly hasn't joined any of the sanctions. That has largely to do with India's relationship with China. It has to do with the fact that India imports most of its arms from Russia and a good deal of its energy, but it's also a standout there. And then you have a range of other countries, the other BRICS, South Africa, Brazil, and then a number of Latin American countries, countries in the Middle East, and countries in Africa, again, who have not sanctioned or condemned Russia. And that means that, if and when this war is over, we will emerge with a situation where you will probably have some form of a new Cold War, with, I would say, a beefed up US military presence in Europe and, if you like, an enhanced containment strategy. But you will have a large number of countries that are a little bit similarly to the non-aligned movement during the original Cold War, that don't want to choose sides between Russia and the West, and will still be doing business with Russia. So I guess where we are today is that the fighting is continuing. I believe that as of today, Russian troops have actually entered the Azovstal steel factory in Mariupol, so where there are, of course, still hundreds of people, including soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, holding out. And so is what's probably a terrible battle going on there. Russia has taken over some towns in the Donbas region and installed governments of occupation there. You have Putin looking towards, we don't know what will happen next Monday on the May the 9th Victory Day parade. Some people believe that he will order general mobilization and overtly declare war on Ukraine instead of calling this a special military operation to denazify Ukraine. Others believe he won't do that. We'll have to see what happens. There are virtual peace talks that have been going on, but they aren't very serious. So the prospects for any kind of settlement really seem very far away. And yet what Putin is left with now is some of his worst nightmares coming true: a more united West, Finland and Sweden poised to join NATO, which they hadn't done or even seriously contemplated since 1949. And the Russian economy, which is adversely affected by these sanctions, prospects for going back to where the Russian economy was, before the Soviet Union collapsed. In other words, Putin has undone, by unleashing this horrible war, he has undone 20 years of him building up the Russian economy, creating globalized cities in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg. So one does have to wonder why he did this and whether it was worth it. But clearly in his own mind, he is trying to build a legacy of restoring Russia as a great power and reuniting Slavic lands. So let me stop there, and I look forward to people's questions and comments.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Stent. It is my pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. David Callaway, a board member of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte and with Atrium Health, who will lead the question and answer session. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Callaway. Go ahead.
Thank you, LJ, and thank you, Dr. Stent. I'm intentionally backlit just to make it seem a little more spooky. I said tremendous information and insight. We greatly appreciate your time. We have some good questions in the chat. I wanted to maybe take a little bit of prerogative and just ask two questions that I think are on a lot of people's mind. What do you think Vladimir Putin sees as the off-ramp for this conflict? When he sits there and contemplates where we are now and whether his miscalculations he realizes or doesn't realize, does he have a longer game? What do you think is going through his brain when he sees the next 3 months, 6 months, 5 years in terms of the Ukraine conflict?
Well, thank you for that question. And that's obviously, the 64,000 ruble question, as they would say. It's possible that if Russia decides in the next weeks to annex the Donbass, the two republics, Luhansk and Donetsk, and actually incorporate them in Russia, he might be willing to say, okay, I mean, they've cut off these republics from Ukraine. They're no longer part of Ukraine. They're now part of Russia. And he could claim that, he's liberated them, he's denazified them, whatever. And then they might also have some referenda in cities like Kherson, which the Russians occupy now, where they will also vote to kind of separate themselves from Ukraine, not necessarily be part of Russia, but be an independent People's Republic. It's possible that he could accept that. I'm more inclined to believe that he would do that, but still Russia has its sights, at least now, on taking Odessa. I mean, it will have taken Mariupol. Odessa is the main port. It's really the economic lifeblood of Ukraine. And right now, there's a world food shortage because the Ukrainians can't export their grain because the Russians have cut them off from the Black Sea. So I think that would be, at this point, a maximal goal of the Russians to essentially cut Ukraine in half and make it almost economically unviable. I'm not sure that the Russians can do that. I think that's what their goal would be. So, if we can call it an off-ramp, to go back to what I said in the beginning, maybe incorporating those two republics into Russia and then holding sway over a number of other places in southeastern Ukraine, and then saying, well, we've accomplished what we wanted to now. I don't think that he would be willing to accept that forever. We don't know how long he's going to be in power, but I could see a situation where you could have, hopefully, a ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities for some time. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't start again. And then, of course, you have the tremendous task of reconstructing Ukraine.
Thank you. Appreciate the insights. Another follow-on question, just again, going back to what is going through Putin's mind. Vladimir Putin met with, he brokered two important deals with China, right, in the lead up to what became the invasion, both for basically a status of force or a peace agreement, so he can move forces from the east, but also this deal on coal purchase. Do you think that this was designed for a small, medium land grab Ukraine, or was this designed with a larger purpose in mind, much like you talked about with, his feeling that the greatest geopolitical travesty of the 20th century was the dissolution of the USSR? Was this, in his mind, the first step towards relitigating or refighting that fight?
I think a lot of us assumed that his goals were more limited to taking the whole of the Donbass, because that's what he was signaling. And, when he did meet with Xi Jinping on February the 4th, it's unclear how much he communicated to Xi Jinping about what his his real goals were. You know, the Chinese ambassador in Washington wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying that, you know, we didn't know this was going to happen. We were not told this. I mean, one can speculate. We'll never know what was really said. But I think it's quite possible that that Xi Jinping did not think that there would be a full-scale invasion. He might have thought that there'd be some sort of territorial adjustment. But on the other hand, you know, the people in our intelligence services certainly had been saying since October that when they looked at the Russian military buildup around Ukraine, there was only one logical explanation for that, and that was a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And, you know, when the CIA director Bill Burns went to Moscow in October and he met with his counterparts, and I guess he had a phone conversation with President Putin, he said to them, you know, we know what you're doing. But I think having said all of that, I think there were still people in this country who also didn't think there would be a full-scale invasion. And apparently a lot of people around Putin didn't know there was going to be a full-scale invasion. They also thought it was going to be something that was going to be more limited. But I think in his own mind, he must have, I mean, we can only speculate, but he must have had that idea there for some time.
What, and going to the mind of the judo master, and I know we like to talk about chess or judo. You brought up a point that I've heard frequently about misinterpreting the resolve of the West, and we certainly have seen the West come together in a unified front. However, as you also mentioned, the Ukraine and Russia are responsible for 30% of the world's wheat, 50% of the sunflower oil. Europe, though they've said we're getting off of oil, they really have no mechanism to get off Russian natural gas, and it's putting money into Russia's coffer. I can't remember what Haas said, but $500 or $50 million a day. Do you think that Putin still thinks that we have the resolve to actually stay strong if this is a 6-month or 12-month? Inflation's rising. There is more domestic divide in the U.S. Thankfully, in my opinion, Le Pen did not win in France. But does he still think that he's got the judo hold and he just needs to put longer term pressure on us and we'll crumble, or does he see a miscalculation here?
I doubt that he really sees a miscalculation yet. So I think the assumption will be in the Kremlin that, and you know, there's probably some basis of truth, that the longer this goes on and the sanctions hit the West as well as Russia, we feel the effects, it's less likely that this kind of unity can hold together. I think it has, and I think it partly has just because of the more atrocities people see and the more brutality, it kind of reinforces the desire to, to make sure that the Russians don't prevail here. But I think he understands that, and I think it's a long waiting game. I mean, one of the reasons he underestimated what the West might do is because he looked back to after the Georgia war, there weren't that many sanctions put on Russia, and very soon relations resumed as normal again. And even in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in the Donbass, there were some sanctions, but still, and Russia was thrown out of the G8, but still there was quite a lot of business as normal. And I think part of him probably still believes that that'll happen again. And you do see, there's debate, particularly in Europe and in this country too, about, whether the West should be supporting the Ukrainians like this. So, and I'm sure that those debates will grow, as inflation is felt more, gasoline prices go up, and there are supply chain shortages too.
Yeah, the complexity is enormous. I'm going to try to combine a few questions that are all related to the general question of how widespread do you think this conflict can become? And then generally, what would you see as some of the key long-term consequences on the geopolitical stage, either vis-a-vis European stability with refugees moving across borders and inflation, or just in general reshaping of Russia's role in the world?
Sure. Sorry. The first part of the first question was
how widespread. How far
will he go?
Would be, and what do you think the consequences could be to the global order?
Sure. So, I think that Putin's initial goals when they launched this war, and they thought that they were going to conquer Ukraine in 72 hours, was to recreate a sort of Slavic state. So that's Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, because Belarus clearly, the leader, Lukashenko, is totally dependent on Russia now after his own sort of fraudulent election a couple of years ago. So that was the goal, was to create this Slavic state, and then possibly looking to northern Kazakhstan, which has a large Slavic population. But that is not within Putin's reach at the moment. Now, we did hear from a general, I guess 2 weeks ago, one of the Russian generals, who said that actually their goal was to keep going west, Odessa, and then Transnistria, which is the breakaway region from Moldova, where you do have Russian troops, and it's a pro-Russian region, and we've actually seen some instability there quite recently. And so I think that, we can maybe surmise from that they do have their eyes on Moldova. So I think Moldova would be, it would be a stretch. You have a pro-European government in Moldova. The president is pro-European, but the leader of the main opposition party is pro-Russian. Moldova is a country that barely has its own armed forces. I think one has to be concerned about this, and particularly since the Transnistrians might declare that they wanted to be part of Russia. Now, if you go back to the two treaties that were proposed to the United States and to NATO in December of last year, one of the treaties said that NATO had to withdraw to its military posture of May 1997. In other words, before NATO enlarged to include Poland. So there are hints there that Russian goals, extended beyond the post-Soviet space, i.e. Ukraine or Moldova, but to the former Warsaw Pact countries like Poland. Now, I'm not sure how serious that was, but I think there's just a lot of uncertainty. And then the Baltic states as well. I mean, everyone feels very vulnerable now. We don't know the extent to which Putin's desire to expand Russia's sphere of influence goes. And at the moment, they're in no position to do that. I'm sorry, what was the next part of the question?
I think you've answered the gist of the question, which was, having to do with this conversation about the instability. I have a very tactical question for you, and it has to do with mostly because during my time there, we're asked to do a lot of training, and I happen to be in a conference right now with several military providers, and there's this tremendous concern about Putin's escalation of, if he decides to escalate, especially with May 9th coming up. And I will just tell you that, as you probably know, there is a great deal of concern about the use of a tactical nuclear weapon or a chemical attack, especially with Mariupol holdouts. What do you see as, obviously this is not for, I guess it's for attribution, but when you think through Putin's desire to escalate, do you think that he would take that next step? And what do you think the consequences would be if he were to use a chemical weapon or a tactical nuclear weapon? Would he do that? Why would he do that? How would that figure into his calculations?
So, rationally, if you raise the issue of using a nuclear weapon, since 1949, since the Soviet Union successfully tested its own nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction has worked. The closest we came to wondering whether it would work was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it has. And so the idea that Russia would use a tactical nuclear weapon to gain advantage in the battlefield, of course, that would then negate, the entire system that has prevailed since we both became nuclear powers. And rationally, you wonder what it would accomplish. Russia's goal is to take territory in Ukraine. using a tactical nuclear weapon might, yes, it might give it some advantages in that, but then, you know, you have to think about the fallout. You can't contain that to a small area, and it would affect, of course, Ukrainians and Russians, but other countries in the region. And then there would be a NATO reaction. Now, President Biden has not spelled out what that would be, I think for obvious reasons, but there would clearly be a reaction to that. So that's not to say that he won't use them, but Putin also likes to sort of scare people and to bully people. And so using rhetoric like that and threatening, which he's done numerous times since the war began and before too, that, you know, we will use weapons that you've never thought of before, and then displaying all the hypersonic and other weapons they have. It's clearly, you know, it's supposed to deter essentially the US and its NATO allies from supplying Ukraine with lethal weapons to defend themselves. So you have to take it seriously, but you can't act as if every threat Putin makes will actually be realized. Some people say that some chemical elements have already been used by the Russians. The Ukrainians say that that they found substances that could be classified as chemical weapons. If they were used on a larger scale, again, I think there would be a robust response, but no government, no Western government is going to tell us what that is.
Hey, Ken, I think that leads into one of the next questions from the audience, and it has to do with Putin's health. And so the Twitter national security experts and the armchair poli-sci people who analyze this, right? Whenever Putin's name comes up, he's a chess master and he's a judo master. But there's also a significant conversation now about, especially given his general history of understanding problem set and control, and this unwillingness to believe that he's been advised incorrectly. Do you think there's any significant impact of cognitive decline or illness that's impacting his ability to think strategically? And again, that brings up this concern of what would a miscalculated next step be that escalates the conflict?
So, of course, I'm neither a physician nor a psychiatrist. So, I mean, what we do know is that he's
that's why we ask you, because then we can't take the blame for it.
What we do know is that he, of course, has been very isolated during COVID. There have been these extraordinary precautions for people who wanted to visit with him during the height of COVID, 2 weeks quarantine, going through a disinfectant tunnel. And you've seen the pictures even now when Secretary General of the United Nations Guterres was there last week, sitting at one of these 20-foot tables, which leads people to question, does he have some other underlying medical condition that makes him more vulnerable, say, to getting COVID? And that's where and then you have the speculation about what he looks like, what medications he might be on, what diseases he might have, lots of rumors about different kinds of cancer. So and then there, of course, there are the rumors about his mental state, about, again, he goes back to medications that maybe contribute to making him paranoid. So, there's so much speculation out there. Really, nobody knows. But I think it is true that he hasn't seen that many people in the past 2.5 years. He has been isolated. He's been surrounded by a few people who feed him information that he wants to hear. And they're presumably the people who also told him it would be a cakewalk in Ukraine, and haven't told him about how badly the army is performing. And in that sense, he's isolated. And if he doesn't have, access to news, we know that, Russia has become increasingly repressive, particularly in the last couple of years. And so he could be sitting there, angry about a lot of different things. And that's where people then bring up, well, if he feels cornered, is he going to strike out? And I think I come back to what I was saying before. I think that's what he wants us to think. He likes everybody to keep guessing. He likes to make people sort of a little off kilter, that they don't, quite know how to interpret things, to keep them guessing, and hopefully then that their will to act will be weaker. So that I think that's all we know, because this is such a hermetically sealed system, and there are wild rumors that emanate from it, including imminent coups and things like that. But until we actually see something happen, we don't know anymore.
There's a question about NATO's role in the conflict, but I'd maybe like to just rephrase it a little bit and ask you, what do you think would be Putin's response to varying levels of NATO engagement? And if you were advising NATO on the right type of engagement that actually helps de-escalate or stabilize this, as opposed to provoking Putin, what do you think NATO's role is? How do you think Putin would interpret different levels of NATO engagement?
Well, I think what Putin sees now is, again, because what he's done has produced the exact opposite of what he wanted, which, he has made NATO focus on the fact that the real purpose of NATO is containing Russia, which, wasn't 5 years ago. That's not what, NATO even official doctrine was. So, at the moment, you have more troops and more NATO troops, more US troops in the easternmost members of NATO, in Poland, Romania, the Baltic states. Putin, of course, doesn't like that, but he invaded Ukraine, and therefore not having those troops there certainly didn't deter him from doing that. So I think NATO is doing the right thing. Individual NATO countries are now supplying Soviet-era weapons to the Ukrainians that they weren't doing before. Putin doesn't like any of this, but I think people understand that if they don't want Russia to win, i.e., to take over Ukraine and destroy its statehood and nationhood, then they really have to do everything they can to prevent that.
And that's it. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, but I think I'd like to just dig into the last comment you made, which is, at this point in the conflict, May 4th, what do you think Putin sees as winning, both in the short run and in the longer run? Because we know that his decisions are not made for a 1 month timeline. What do you think winning looks like to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think, winning for him would have been to have absorbed Ukraine, essentially. And I still think that as long as he's in power, that's going to be his long-term goal, is to subjugate Ukraine. He may realize that, that for a shorter amount of time, he's going to have to accept something less than that, controlling the Donbass, maybe annexing it. But I think he's not going to give up on trying to, subordinate Ukraine to Russia.
So even with short-term setbacks, winning still looks like reuniting the old USSR, even today, if we were to start new.
Well, not reuniting the whole of the USSR, but at least reuniting Ukraine and Russia, which for him is the most important successor state.
Excellent. LJ, I think, maybe we have time for 1 more question. Well, this is always the good one, where you get to envision being more powerful and having a more painful life. If you were advising the president of the U.S. for a week, and the president would listen and execute all levers of power on your advice, what policy recommendations would you have that you think could contain and or depose of Putin's power? Got a big one, but this is the visioning exercise.
Well, I think the U.S. has to continue what it's doing, which is, providing the Ukrainians with the wherewithal, to resist the Russians and to push them back. And that's what the U.S. is doing, and it should continue to do this. I might wish that the U.S. might have been less categorical about saying that no U.S. troops would ever be fighting in Ukraine. I don't think the president had to say that. He could have retained some kind of, strategic ambiguity, but he didn't do that. I think he had his own reasons for not for being clear on that. But I think to continue what it's doing, because all other ways of trying to engage Russia haven't worked out. Remember, the Biden administration wanted a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. There was a summit between the two presidents, and it looked as if we were re-engaging the Russians on the most important issues: strategic stability, cyber ransomware, climate, things like that. And that's just all gone by the wayside now.
Yeah, it seems like a tremendous waste of energy and focus right now, and there's so many challenges that can be worked on together. But well, Dr. Stent, thank you for the time, and thank you very much for all the tremendous insight, and thank you to all of our people who joined online with your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. Tried to unify them as much as possible, but just a really informative and very timely talk. And again, thank you very, very much. LJ, back to you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Callaway, for moderating and so ably, and we appreciate it. Dr. Angela Stent, what a pleasure. We wish we could have you here live in Charlotte. It's a wonderful city, warm, nice people. We hope to have you in the future. I do hope that this invasion stops, and that hope that the peace prevails sooner than later. And with that, I would like to turn it over to the chairman of the board of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, Wayne Cooper. Wayne?
Thank you, LJ. Boy, I tell you, I echo your sentiments, LJ, that I'm looking forward to hearing you again when you come back to Charlotte, when you come to Charlotte. But Dr. Stent, thank you so much for just an excellent presentation. You made a difficult subject so easy to understand, and you're also a very good speaker, and we appreciate you being with us today. And thank all of you for joining us today. Remember, we've got some great, outstanding programs coming up. Well, all of our programs are outstanding. But remember, as LJ always tells us, that if you're not a member, please become one. If you are a member, please upgrade your membership. And we'll see you at the very next event. Thank you again, Dr. Stent.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all.
Thank you.